was end of December. I was only 17 at the time. And every year, just before Christmas week, my mom had to go on a 3-day business trip for work. Being an only child that lived just with my mom, I'd spend these days that she was gone home alone. Usually she'd leave just before winter break, so I'd be in school for most of the day, but this year she left the same day that our school let out for the holidays. I had the house to myself and wanted nothing more than to stay inside and chill all day. Our city was going through somewhat of a snowstorm, so I couldn't really leave the house anyway. I made some of the food that was left for me and found a new movie to watch. I had to pause it several times throughout the couple hours though, because the wind and snow would suddenly pick up and get really loud. It seemed like every time I looked outside, the weather was worse. Then, around 7 or 8, someone was walking up to the front door. I could hear their footsteps kicking against the snow, and they coughed several times as they slowly made their way up to the porch. I didn't have a clue who it could be. We paused everything and looked at the door, waiting for them to knock or ring the doorbell. As more time passed, though, I could feel myself getting nervous as something didn't feel right. I want to say I waited 3 or 4 minutes, not hearing anything, before I went up to the door and looked outside. Then there came the door. Nobody was there. I could see the footsteps coming right up to the door, then going back the way they came. I was really confused how clearly I heard them walk up, but somehow I didn't hear them leave. Oof. Already? Also, with the snowstorm outside, what reason could someone have to come up to my house? I think the only reason I could settle on was that the snow made it difficult to see, and they mistook my house for theirs. Maybe they realized once they got up to the porch and didn't want to alarm anyone, so they quietly left. It's probably a bit of a stretch, but I guess it was possible. After a while, I'd mostly stopped thinking about the situation and was more caught up worrying about the storm. The power cut out a few times, lasting for several minutes before it came back on. Because of that, I couldn't really watch TV or anything, so I just sat on the couch and scrolled on my phone. It was maybe round 11 when, through the harsh wind, I heard a thump against the house. I initially ignored it, but only a few moments later, the power cut out again. Thinking the thump might have caused it, I got up. Slowly, I walked over to the window. I trained my gaze to look through and worry over. The brick. Helma, I thought. It sounded like it was from the side, near the kitchen, so I turned my phone light on, then walked over and looked around. I thought it was probably just a coincidence that the power shut off right after I heard the thump, but I just wanted to be sure nothing happened. I didn't see anything, and I started to walk away. Hey! I jumped and looked at the back door, seeing a man standing against the other side. The back porch light wasn't on, so he was mostly covered by the dark. I could only see his face peering in at me. "Hey kid, would you get the door for me? It's freezing out here," he said, putting his hand on the door and trying to open it. My head wasn't fully grasping the situation yet, and I kind of just stood there and stared at him. "Kid, get the door, please." Something gave me a bad feeling. I knew better than to trust this guy, even though it was a blizzard outside. The man started coughing, and I started to back up, and the man's face instantly fell into a disturbing frown. "Open the fucking door," he yelled, banging his fist against it several times. "Sob," said the man. I ran back to the couch and got my phone. I then stood in the hallway and watched the man as I dialed 911. My phone was struggling to hold service and kept dropping the call, but after a few tries, I was able to get through long enough to ask for help. "Wait," it erupted in frustration. "Let us get to Wither." The man at the door continued to yell at me and hit the door, but eventually ran off. I'm assuming the snowstorm caused some trouble for the police, as they didn't make it until nearly 30 minutes after. I told them what I could, and I called my mom to let her know what happened. Nobody really knew what to think of it. He could have been stalking me and trying to guilt me into letting him in, or he could have actually been in need of help, although it's unlikely. I never saw him again after that night, though. I had visited my family for the holidays and was driving back home. The trip in total was about 10 hours, which I split into 2 drives on the way up, but on the way back, I decided to power through it in one long drive. Around the halfway point, snow started coming down. It wasn't too much, so I wasn't worried about it. However, it got worse as I kept driving. Once I was 3 hours away from home, it was pouring down pretty heavily, and with the sun going down as well, it definitely was not ideal. There were almost no other cars out though, which is the only reason I decided to keep driving. The snow made it harder, but I was still on track to be home by the end of the night. It was just after the sun had fully set, and about 30 minutes out from the nearest town I'd just passed through, that I noticed a car on the road ahead of me. Their headlights were the only light on the road, in the middle of the blanket of snow covering everything else. And as I got closer, it was clear that they were stuck, or at least not moving. Their car was sideways on the road, with their hazard lights flickering, and a man was standing out in the cold next to it. Obviously, with the snow and cold, I really didn't have a choice. His car was blocking most of the road off that was paved. I parked just behind him. The man immediately started waving at me and walked up to my window. He asked me. My car slid and got stuck there. "Can you help me push it out?" He spoke slowly, like his English wasn't the best, but hoping I could get back on the road as soon as possible. I agreed to help him. The car didn't really look like it was in too much snow, so maybe just a little push might actually be enough. I threw my hat and gloves on, then got out. The wind hitting my face and snow instantly soaking me made me wonder why the guy even got out of his car and didn't just call for help. My face and hands were already getting numb, so I hurried to the back of his car and waited for him to get his gloves. It was too dark to see anything through the windows, and after a little bit of standing back there waiting, I looked around to see what was taking him so long. He was still leaning into the front seat, as if looking for his gloves, but I thought I heard him talking. A second later, he came back out and looked at me. "Ah, were you talking to me?" I asked. He looked concerned, but said he was just talking. "To himself," I said. He looked concerned, but said he was just talking to himself. He smiled, then walked around to the back to help me push. I couldn't help but feel like something had changed, though. His whole demeanor and the situation just felt different. Although I didn't hear what he said, it didn't really sound like he was talking to himself. But if someone else was in the car, then why was he out here alone and asking for my help? All these thoughts came rushing through my head, and I guess for a few seconds I was kind of spaced out. So much so that I didn't notice the man staring at me. His smile had dropped, and he had an eerie look in his eyes, like they were hollow and lifeless, completely opposite of what he looked like before. I didn't even hesitate, beginning to hurry back to my car. Just then, several doors from the car I was just behind opened, and 3 more men got out rushing toward me. I sprinted into my driver's seat, and thank goodness I left my car on, because I put it straight in drive and rolled past them, almost hitting one on the way out. I was terrified of possibly getting stuck in the snowbank, as the path around their car was very thin. But thankfully, I made it around and was able to get away. I put in a report with the police at the closest town, but there were never any updates as far as I know. I'm assuming the men weren't really stuck and probably left right after I did. I don't know what those men were up to. Of course, I have my guesses. But if I had stayed and didn't leave right when I did, who knows where I'd be. This was last year. It was late November, and this was the first snowfall of the season. It wasn't supposed to be anything too much, just a couple inches of snow. I got home from work around 8, and by then the snow had already started. I heated up some leftover pizza and stayed downstairs for a couple hours. Around 10, I went upstairs to my bedroom, sitting at my desk with my laptop. Before I could even open up something to watch, I heard something right above me. It sounded like a thud in the ceiling. I thought it was likely the snow weighing down on the roof, and was probably nothing to be concerned about. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't concerned at all, though. This was my first winter at this house, and it wasn't in the best shape, so part of me was a little worried about any possible leaks or other problems that could happen with the snow. Tried to not think about it too much and continued looking for something to watch, but then it happened again. A thud resonating through the ceiling. I looked up, and the thuds continued, sounding almost in a straight line across the ceiling. I was genuinely worried now. I got up and grabbed my winter jacket, then hurried out the front door and looked up at the roof. Unexpectedly, the side of the roof that my bedroom was under, there was no snow on it. And so it had all slid off and fell into a pile in front of the house. I looked at the other side of the roof, and the snow was still there. I then looked at my neighbors' homes, and all of them still had snow sitting on their roofs. Normal. The way the snow had fallen off just one side of my roof didn't seem natural, like something was either wrong with my roof or something else had made this happen. Probably whatever those thuds were that I was hearing. With no more answers to find outside, and my whole body starting to shiver from the cold, I walked back to the front door, pumping my boots. I opened it and hurried inside, stomping my boots on the doormat. When I looked up, though, my heart almost stopped. There were puddles of water going across the hallway. The light from the glow was so bright, I stayed still and looked around, seeing water going through the living room and even up the stairs next to me. It only took me a second to see a boot print in one of the puddles, and I immediately turned right back around and headed out the door. I stood by the road and called the police, shivering as I tried to tell them my situation. About 30 seconds into the call, I saw something move past one of the windows in my bedroom, and moments later, a figure stood behind the glass, looking down at me. They only stayed for a second, then backed away. I didn't see anything else the rest of the time that I waited for the police. As I was waiting, though, I'd put together most of the pieces in my mind. Someone had made it up on the roof, making the snow fall as they walked across. There were several windows they could have gotten in from that I honestly had no idea if they were locked or not. But when police arrived, they didn't find the intruder inside anymore, but they basically confirmed my theory. There were multiple trees going over top my house that anyone could easily climb, and with the windows being accessible, it made for an easy target. At least the officers think that's the reason they broke in, just because I was an easy target. Nothing was missing though, and the way the shoe prints went through the whole house felt eerily like them looking for me. What's crazy is that I must have gone outside to check on the roof at the exact time they got through the window. If I was any later, I would have been face to face with them. Or, if I had gone back inside sooner, they might have not left tracks through the house yet for me to immediately notice. It's been nearly an entire year since this, and so far, nothing else has happened. Maybe it was just a one-time attempt, but I don't think I'll ever feel safe with all the uncertainties of what happened that night. Last winter, my friend Colin and I decided to spend a week in a cabin deep in the forests of Alaska. It seemed like a perfect escape from the monotony of our small-town lives. The cabin was a 2-hour drive from my house, tucked away from civilization. From the house, we would slow truck up a vast hill in the direction of our home to the glazed gray of the season. Colin had found it online, advertised as a secluded spot with breathtaking views and a wood-burning stove to keep us warm. The idea of snow-covered trees and peaceful nights by the fire sounded like a dream. We packed our things, loaded up my truck, and set off in the early afternoon. The drive was uneventful at first. The road grew narrower as we got closer to the cabin, and soon it was just a trail cutting through the endless forest. By the time we arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. The cabin was small but cozy, with a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a fireplace that looked like it had seen better days. Surrounding it was nothing but towering trees and silence. After unpacking, we decided to stretch our legs and explore the area before it got too dark. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the trees are listening. Our boots crunched through the snow as we followed a narrow path winding between the pines. That's when we heard it, a scream. "Ruah, is everything all right?" said the woman. "Sorry." It was faint at first, just a distant cry carried by the wind. Colin and I stopped in our tracks, exchanging a nervous glance. Then it came again, louder this time, and unmistakably human. It was the kind of scream that made your stomach twist, raw and desperate, like someone was in serious trouble. "We have to check it out," Colin said. He was always braver than me, or maybe just more reckless. The bird tailed. I wanted to turn back and pretend we hadn't heard anything, but I couldn't leave someone out there if they needed help. We followed the sound, our footsteps quick and uneven. The screams grew louder as we pushed deeper into the forest, and soon we spotted a faint light ahead. It was a cabin, much older and more run down than ours. The windows were grimy and the roof sagged under the weight of the snow. The light inside flickered, like it was coming from a fire or a lantern. As we crept closer, the screaming stopped. It was replaced by a low, muffled sound, like someone crying or gasping for air. Colin gestured for me to stay back while he approached the window. He wiped a small patch of frost off the glass and peered inside. I'll never forget the look on his face when he turned back to me, wide-eyed and pale as the snow around us. "There's a guy tied to a chair," he said, "and another man. He's wearing a mask. He's got a knife." I felt my heart drop. My legs turned to jelly, and for a second, I couldn't move. Colin was already backing away from the window when a voice cut through the air behind us. "What are you doing?" We spun around, and there he was. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing just a few feet away. He was dressed in a heavy coat and boots, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. Slowly, so slowly we were half afraid to breathe, he turned around. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them on us, sharp and cold. Neither of us said a word. Colin grabbed my arm, and we bolted. The man shouted something, but I didn't stop to listen. The trees blurred past us as we ran, our breath steaming in the frigid air. I could hear the crunch of snow behind us, his footsteps heavy and relentless. My lungs burned and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, but I didn't dare look back. We reached our cabin and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other, trying to catch our breath. Then we turned off the lights and peered out the window, expecting to see the man charging toward us, but the forest was empty. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees. Colin grabbed his phone and called the authorities. It felt like an eternity before they arrived, but eventually we saw the flashing red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. 2 officers stepped out of their vehicle, their breath fogging up in the cold as we hurried outside to meet them. We told them everything about the screams, the man tied up, the masked figure, and the guy who had chased us. They didn't seem entirely convinced, but they agreed to check out the old cabin. We led them back through the forest, our flashlights slicing through the shadows. When we reached the cabin, my stomach twisted. The place was empty. No light, no screaming, no signs of anyone. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the wind, and inside was nothing but an empty room with a dusty floor and a broken chair in the corner. The officers said they'd continue their search and told us to stay in our cabin for the night. We didn't sleep at all. I kept picturing the man in the mask, wondering if he was out there, watching us. Stopped sleeping until coming home to my mantle by the middle of the night. We waited, 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 and it was basically dark by then. It was freezing cold, with no heat for its water. 2 days later, the authorities called to let us know they had caught the men. They didn't give us many details, just that they had found both the masked man and the guy who had been tied up. The officer on the phone sounded uneasy, like there was more to the story he wasn't telling us. When I pressed him for answers, he simply said, "It's better if you don't know." We left the cabin that same day, cutting our trip short. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt wrong, like it was hiding secrets we weren't meant to uncover. Even now, back at home, I can't shake the memory of that night. The screams, the masked man, the chase, it's all burned into my mind. Sometimes I wonder what happened in that cabin. Who were those men, and why was one of them being tortured? The authorities never told us, and maybe it's better that way. But every so often, when I'm lying awake at night, I think about that voice in the forest, low and cold. What are you doing? I had always imagined California is sunny, but that night, everything was covered in white. It was like someone had painted the whole world with a thick, snowy brush. As I swung my legs off the bed, I glanced toward the window to check how much snow had fallen. I had been excited earlier that day, wondering what the neighborhood would look like under a thick blanket of snow. When I pulled back the curtain, I was stunned. The snow was deeper than I'd ever seen. It piled up past the curb, completely smooth and untouched. The streetlights reflected off the snow, making it glow faintly in the dark. It was beautiful, almost magical. No cars, no people, just pure white stillness. I decided to go downstairs to get a drink of water after using the bathroom. The cold tiles of the bathroom floor made me shiver, but I didn't think much of it. I walked down the stairs, turned on the light in the kitchen, and grabbed a glass from the cabinet. The house felt strangely empty. It was probably just the snowstorm, I told myself. It made everything feel quieter than usual. After drinking the water, I stood there for a second, letting my eyes adjust to the brightness of the kitchen light. That's when I heard it. Soft click. It came from the direction of the front door. My first thought was that it was just a branch knocking against it. The wind outside was fierce. Maybe something had blown against the house. Shrugging it off, I turned off the light and headed back upstairs. The stairs creaked slightly under my feet, as they always did. When I got to my room, I looked out the window again. This time, something was different. There were footprints in the snow, fresh ones. They started right at the edge of my driveway, near the house, and walked toward the neighbor's backyard. I stared at them, trying to process what I was seeing. It hadn't been more than 4 minutes since I last looked outside. How could someone have made those tracks so quickly without me hearing anything? I squinted at the footprints, trying to see if they looped back or continued further. They didn't. They just vanished behind the neighbor's house, as if the person had walked into thin air. A strange feeling washed over me, but I tried to push it aside. I told myself it was just some teenager messing around in the snow. Maybe someone taking a shortcut to their backyard. It wasn't a big deal. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept looking out the window, watching the snow, waiting to see if someone came back. The next morning, I went downstairs and found my mom and dad in the living room. They looked upset. My mom was sitting on the couch, holding her hands tightly together, while my dad paced back and forth. "What's wrong?" I asked, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Concern written across my mother's face. She glanced at Prudence. My dad stopped and looked at me. "Your mom's gold jewelry set is missing," he said. That jewelry set was special. My dad had given it to my mom on their wedding anniversary. It wasn't just expensive. It was sentimental. My mom never wore it often, but she kept it in a small wooden box in their bedroom. "How?" I asked, my voice shaky. "We don't know. We didn't hear anything, but it's gone." Suddenly, I remembered the footprints. My heart started beating faster as I told them about what I'd seen the night before. The fresh tracks in the snow, leading from our house to the neighbor's backyard. My dad frowned and said we needed to check the CCTV cameras we had installed around the house. We all rushed to the small monitor hooked up to the cameras. My dad rewound the footage to the time I had gone downstairs for water. Haltingly, I inspected the cameras for signs of what they were. At first, everything looked normal. The camera at the front door showed nothing but the falling snow. The backyard camera was the same. But when my dad switched to the camera in the kitchen, we all froze. The footage showed me walking into the kitchen, turning on the light, and getting a glass of water. But in the corner of the screen, near the doorway leading to the dining room, there was movement. A man. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes, and he was standing perfectly still, half hidden by the doorframe. His head was tilted slightly, and he was watching me. "Oh Lord," he thought, "I've just tried to get out. My legs fathom farther than my feet, and I must stay alive." Watching me the entire time I was in the kitchen. I didn't notice him at all. My mom gasped, covering her mouth. "Oh," she tweeted. "Son," my dad cursed under his breath. We rewound the footage again and again, trying to make out the man's face, but it was too blurry. The camera wasn't good enough to catch any details. Anne had sold her soul, and she sold. The man must have slipped out while I was going back upstairs. Maybe that was the click I heard, the door opening and closing. We called the police immediately, but when they arrived, they couldn't do much. I don't know what to do. The officers checked the footage and said it wasn't clear enough to identify the intruder. They followed the footprints outside, but the snowstorm had started again, covering the tracks. The police told us to be more careful, to lock all the doors and windows, and improve our security. But that was it. No leads, no answers. For weeks after that, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the footage. How long had he been in our house? Did he watch me come downstairs? What would have happened if I had noticed him? It was December in Minnesota, and the world outside my window was covered in snow, about a foot thick. Everything felt so quiet, like the snow had muffled the entire neighborhood. My parents were out at a bar that night, and my brother was over at a friend's house. I had the house to myself, which didn't bother me much. I liked the peace. I was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a blanket, watching some show on TV. The glow from the screen lit up the room, while the rest of the house stayed dark. I remembered the clock on the ticking steadily, marking the passing time. I had just finished a bag of chips when I heard it, a faint knocking sound. It came from the basement. At first, I thought maybe it was just the old pipes. The knocking sound stilled. Our house was old, and it had its fair share of strange noises, especially in the winter. But this didn't quite sound like the usual creaks or groans. It was deliberate, soft, but steady. Curiosity got the better of me, so I stood up, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders like a cape, and made my way toward the basement door. The floor felt cold under my socks, and the air seemed to get heavier as I reached for the handle. I opened the door, flipped the light switch, and peered down the stairs. "I think," Bessie said. The light slightly reddened the light flickered for a moment before holding steady, casting long shadows on the walls. I took the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. When I reached the bottom, I looked around. The basement smelled faintly of dust and old cardboard. Everything looked exactly as it should. Boxes neatly stacked in the corners, an old desk covered in papers, and a few plastic bins near the far wall. Nothing seemed out of place. I walked around, checking the small windows for any sign of movement or a draft that could have caused the noise. Nothing, just stillness. With a shrug, I figured it was probably my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe snow shifting against the house. I went back upstairs, closed the basement door, and returned to the couch. 5 minutes later, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it. A loud crash from the basement, followed by what sounded like a door slamming open. My heart raced as I sat up, staring at the basement door. This time, it wasn't something I could dismiss. The sound was sharp and clear, like something heavy being knocked over. I hesitated for a moment before standing. The house suddenly felt too quiet, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker than before. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe my brother had come home early without telling me. Maybe he was trying to scare me as a joke. I called his name as I opened the door, my voice shaky. "Ryan, is that you?" Silence. I called again, louder this time, but the only response was the faint hum of the basement light. I swallowed hard and started down the stairs. The air felt colder now, and the basement light flickered again as I reached the bottom. The desk drawers were open, and papers were scattered across the floor. Boxes that had been neatly stacked were now tipped over, their contents spilling out. The plastic bins near the wall had been knocked over as well, their lids lying a few feet away. It looked like someone had been searching for something, but the worst part was the back door. It was wide open, the glass fogged up from the freezing air pouring in. Snow had blown inside, forming a thin layer on the floor near the doorframe. And there, leading out into the backyard, were footprints. They were deep, clear, and fresh, disappearing into the snowy night. Aha! I froze for a moment, my thoughts spinning. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been in my basement while I was just a floor above, oblivious. The idea made my skin crawl. I ran to the door and slammed it shut, locking it as quickly as I could. My fingers fumbled with my phone as I called my parents. My mom answered, and I tried to explain what happened, my voice shaking. She told me to stay put, that they were on their way home. When they arrived, my dad grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to follow the footprints. My mom stayed with me, her hand on my shoulder, trying to keep me calm. My dad's boots crunched in the snow as he moved across the yard, following the tracks over the fence and onto the road behind our house. He came back a few minutes later, shaking his head. The footprints stopped at the road. Whoever it was had probably gotten into a car and driven away. The police came not long after. "Now, yes, this." They walked through the basement, taking notes and looking for any signs of forced entry, but there weren't any. The door hadn't been broken, it had been unlocked. My dad swore he had locked it earlier, but maybe it hadn't latched properly. The officers told us it might have been a random burglary, someone picking up our house because it looked empty. But part of me wondered if it was more than that. The way everything had been searched through so carefully made it feel personal. Like whoever it was had been looking for something specific.